How do you view the adoption of technologies like MCP in modern software development? And do you think it's a passing trend, like a fad, or something that will remain relevant and useful for devs on a longer term basis?
I have kind of mixed thoughts about this. I don't think it's a passing trend, but that being said, it's kind of like, I see how it's useful and how people can leverage it to do a bunch of different things. One of the concerns that I have is like, I was thinking about, if you wanted to write an agent that used MCP to do things, like what kind of things could you build with MCP to make the agent do? And one of the things that I've been doing recently, that are like more manual work that I was thinking, it'd be kind of cool if you could automate this, is like in Timescale Cloud, we have these, the vectorizer that is like is the cloud hosted vectorizer, and it runs, and sometimes they fail and there are errors and so on. And so like there's a certain number of steps that I take to like debug these things and like look into issues and like maybe take an action or something like that. And I was thinking, well, it'd be kind of cool if you could write an agent that could basically take those actions for you. You could write an MCP server for it, basically. You tell it, like, I mean, this is like kind of for Timescale Cloud's infrastructure specifically. You would basically tell it, like, this is how you figure out, let's say, vectorizers that have been failing in the last 15 minutes. So like maybe the agentic loop that I'd write is like, okay, like sleep for 15 minutes, now wake up and check to see like which ones failed in the last 15 minutes. And then it could run a query and it could do that. And then I could tell, okay, and this is how you'd like debug further like this thing to figure out what kind of state it's in and so on. And then maybe one of the actions we wanted to take is like, I don't know, send a Slack message or manually do something in the database, like also then another command where like, I don't know, the command would be pause vectorizer or something like that. The concern that I have, so that idea sort of like appeared in my mind. It's like, oh, that'd be kind of like a pretty cool use case, like something that you could do, right? But then the first concern is, okay, well, like what actually does this thing have access to? What is it doing? What could it potentially do? How do I limit that? Like internally, our infrastructure is not very mature when it comes to security controls or sanity controls of like what kinds of things people can do. So there's a lot of trust put into individual developers that they're not going to do the wrong thing. And so with the level of maturity that we have internally, throwing a bot at it like scares the shit out of me, right? Like it would be able to do theoretically, potentially to do far too much stuff. Like that's exactly the concern that you immediately saw. It's like, yeah, okay, actually what you want to do is have it like integrated in like a human in the loop kind of thing where you can like, it's popping up and it's saying, okay, this is the action that I think should be taken. Like, do you want to take this action? But it's still kind of like, I don't know, there's still a concern there around, well, how do you gate this thing off? Like, yeah, you want to give it access to things, but like maybe different types of bots should have different levels of access to like read-only things or like write actions or that kind of thing. And like there's a lot of, let's say, maturity that's lacking around what you would want to be able to do ideally. I think that there is utility there that is not just novelty or like, oh, hey, this is kind of cool. It feels a little bit far off right now because there's a lot of things that are obstacles to adoption that, at least for, let's say, serious production use cases, would kind of put a burden in there. Part of the concern, which I have not expressed, is the thing that we kind of always ignore or like, I don't know, blend out with these agents is that you're giving it some commands, it can run some stuff, it will see something, it'll take what it sees, pass it to OpenAI or to Anthropic, then it'll get a response back and kind of like do something with that. And there's this question not only around like what actions can it take, but also what can it see? What will it be exposing that, are things that maybe you don't want to be exposing and you don't realize it, or you're not that cognizant of it in that moment. But actually like what you've been doing is sending your customer information. Who are your customers? How many customers do you have? You're telling all this stuff to OpenAI or to Anthropic. And that's something where it's like companies need to have an understanding of what they are willing to share and not share. To kind of have a posture effectively on this type of thing, to be able to enable, or at least like, to set the boundaries of like, okay, this is what's allowed, this is what's not allowed. Like anything that would expose any information about who our customers are or what they're doing.
You can think of generative AI without tools or MCP or whatever the name would be as computer without internet. It can do certain things, but you really open up another dimension if you give your computer access to the internet or your LLM access to tools, MCP, whatever, let it interact with the outside world. This will remain relevant for the longer term. Right now, I would say the whole thing is its infancy, and there are a whole bunch of things that need to be solved, especially in the area of security, compliance, and so on. I was really excited to see what it can do with a simple Postgres MCP, like how it can interrogate the schemas, how it can find answers from my data without like initially knowing it. Well, I either have to figure out the way with tools to do the same, but usually I would use the brute force and like schemas, try to figure out what's there. I would recommend exactly this approach for production use, the proof of concept. That's amazing. Like right now you see tools, MCP tools that gives you access to your SQL database, tools that give you access to your file system, tools that give you access to a bash prompt. It can be very dangerous, with or without bad intentions. I worked with a lot of major financial institutions, say in Canada. They are very, very cautious about adopting Gen AI in general. And I can imagine right now they not putting anything like that into production without a lot of security reviews. And I would imagine probably right now there are very few, if any, tools attaching production databases, production financial systems for that reason. I think it's the same procedure as with any other new technology that can potentially expose their data. And again, there are whole departments and large organizations that do security. It's just a new field, so like list of requirements and checkboxes that would be required for adopting the MCP tool might not be fully developed yet. Again, security would be the major bottleneck, if you will, in adopting.
The AI tools in general are not a fad. I guess MCP reminds me of like the language server protocol for IDEs. So if you have an IDE or an editor and you're writing plain text, but if you're writing something that's Python and you want syntax highlighting and code completion and all of these things you would expect from an IDE, your editor needs to understand the Python language, and it needs to understand the context of like the libraries you're using and what functions are available and all of that stuff. And so the language server protocol is a way for people to write something that knows Python or knows Go or knows Rust, and then plug that knowledge into the editor so that it can say, hey, I've got this chunk of text. Tell me what I need to highlight. Tell me how to complete this code, this line of code. MCP seems like the same sort of thing, but for, LLM chatbots or LLM agentic stuff. Well, not even to do that. I think it's just a way to give agents agency, a way to like interact with the environment. An MCP server that lets them play with the file system, play with the database, kind of whatever you want your LLM to be able to do needs a tool to affect that change in the environment, right? And so MCP is just a way of saying, well, I want my LLM to order things for me on Amazon, so I'm going to plug in an MCP server that lets it do it. I wrote the first version of Text-to-SQL. So you've got a database and maybe you don't know SQL, which is what you interact with a database with. So it would be a way of saying, I have a question about my data in natural language, and I want the database or I want something to write the query for me that would address that question and give me the answers back. So you pass text in and you get SQL out. I was writing that in Python. And so you have to, it's very low level where you say like, I'm going to send a message to an LLM that says, you're an expert developer. Here's a question about a database. You give it like descriptions of your tables, and then you say, here's a tool that will let you search for more tables that might be relevant. Here is a tool that lets you check your SQL to make sure it's valid syntax, lets you record your answer once you think a good one. And all of that is code that you have to write. Each tool you have to define with JSON schema. And you send that message off, and when you get the message back, you have to loop over the message and say, he is asking for me to run this tool. I have to say, oh, well, that's the check my SQL tool and find the arguments and then run it. And then I have to take the output of that tool and send it back. It's a lot of code to write to have to do that interaction. I guess some of it depends on the frameworks you use. So like the Python framework for MCP, defining the tools becomes easier because you can just kind of decorate a Python function and say it's a tool. And with some of the like client side frameworks, you just say, hey, I want to use this MCP tool, this MCP server. And a lot of that is the definition of the tools, and the calling and response is sort of abstracted away by the frameworks. A big part of it is like, if you have written an MCP server that does the thing that I want it to do, I just kind of hook into it. I don't really have to replicate that.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, would also be true if you wrote it as a library, but then, like if I was using Python, you'd need to write Python. And
Yeah.
so it just makes everything a little more plug and play.